I don't wish what happened to me on anyone. Keep watching. As we drove home that night, the silence between Sarah and me felt like a living thing, thick, heavy, and suffocating. I kept my hands firmly on the wheel, knuckles tight, eyes locked on the road, but my mind raced in circles. Sarah sat as far from me as the car allowed, her body turned toward the window, her face illuminated by passing streetlights. She hadn't said a word since we left Jason and Melissa's house. Maybe she knew there was nothing she could say to undo what had just happened. The night had started innocently enough. We had been to plenty of these dinner parties with the Carters before, all laughter and wine discussing work, kids, vacations. But tonight had taken a dark turn, one I never saw coming. I guess I should have noticed Sarah's strange silence as the evening wore on, or the way she kept avoiding my gaze when the women began whispering to each other as Jason tapped his wineglass for everyone's attention. He stood up smiling, and then dropped the bomb. "Ladies, it's time for the tradition. You know what to do." My confusion must have been obvious. I looked around, expecting someone to explain what was happening, but instead, I watched as the women, one by one, removed their bracelets and tossed them into a woven basket that Melissa carried around. I shot Sarah a look, silently pleading for answers, but she was already reaching for her bracelet, fingers moving with disturbing ease. She tossed it into the basket without even meeting my eyes. That was when the realization hit me like a freight train. The so-called tradition was no innocent game. The men were meant to draw a bracelet, and whoever's bracelet they picked, they would spend the night with that woman. I stood there frozen, my brain short-circuiting, unable to believe what was unfolding in front of me. And Sarah, my wife, knew about it all along. I pulled her aside, my voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Did you know about this?" I asked, my throat tight. Sarah's response was so casual, so indifferent, it made my skin crawl. "Yes," she said, not a trace of guilt in her voice. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't agree. But come on, James, it's just one night. It's not a big deal." I felt the room spin. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my hands clenched into fists. "Not a big deal? You're talking about sleeping with someone else, Sarah. How is that not a big deal?" Her answer, or lack of one, told me everything. She saw this as some harmless adventure, something to bring excitement into our marriage. But all I could see was betrayal. Betrayal of our love, our trust, everything we had built together over the past decade. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't watch this farce play out. I gave her an ultimatum: leave with me now, or I was done. For a moment, just a flicker, I thought she would choose me. But then she sighed, like I was the unreasonable one, and said, "You're overreacting. It's just one night." That was the moment I knew. I turned, my chest heavy, and stormed out of the house. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence as I left her behind. Left behind everything we once were. The car hummed along the empty streets, but my mind was louder. How had everything crumbled so fast? How had Sarah become a stranger in just one night? I couldn't go home, not like this. Not when the life I thought I knew had been shattered. I pulled into the parking lot of a cheap motel and checked in, too numb to even feel the weight of what was happening. Inside the small, dingy room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone as message after message from Sarah appeared on the screen. Her words were filled with justification, excuses really. But there was no apology, no remorse, just cold defense. I tossed the phone aside and let out a long, broken breath. My marriage wasn't just damaged. It was over. The next morning, I woke up in that dingy motel room with an ache deep in my chest that hadn't lessened overnight. The room was bathed in a dim, gray light that made everything feel lifeless, much like how I felt inside. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the events from the night before in my head. But it was no nightmare. It was reality. Sarah had made her choice, and I had made mine. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. More texts from Sarah. I didn't open them. I couldn't. Whatever she had to say wouldn't change the betrayal. Her excuses from the night before were still fresh in my mind. It wasn't that she had lied to me about the party. That was bad enough. It was that she saw nothing wrong with it. She didn't care that it had destroyed everything between us. I sat on the bed, my heart heavy with the weight of what came next. Divorce. There was no way around it. I didn't see how we could come back from this. But before I made any decisions, I needed advice. Someone to help me think clearly, someone who could give me perspective. I called Alex, my oldest friend. We'd been through everything together, and if anyone could help me get through this mess, it was him. He picked up on the second ring. "James, you all right, man? You sound off," he said, his voice filled with concern. I sighed, rubbing my eyes. "No, I'm not all right. You got time to meet up? I could use some advice." "Yeah, of course. Let's grab some coffee. I'll meet you at Davis's diner in 20 minutes later. I slid into a booth at the diner, Alex already waiting with 2 steaming cups of black coffee in front of him. The place was mostly empty, save for a few early risers at the counter. I hadn't eaten a thing since the party, but food was the last thing on my mind. "So," Alex began, leaning forward, "what happened?" I took a long sip of coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down my throat. Then, in a low voice, I told him everything. From the moment Jason made his twisted announcement, to Sarah's casual indifference, and finally, to the ultimatum I had given her. Alex listened quietly, nodding, his brow furrowed in disbelief as I spoke. When I finished, he sat back, shaking his head. "Damn, James. That's brutal. You think?" I said with a bitter laugh. "What the hell am I supposed to do? How do I move on from this?" Alex looked me dead in the eye. "You can't stay in a marriage with someone who doesn't respect your boundaries. What she did, it's not just about the party, man. It's about trust. And once that's broken, I don't know if you can ever get it back." I stared into my coffee, feeling the truth of his words sink in. Trust was the foundation of everything. Without it, what was left? "I've been through it," Alex continued. "My ex tried to make me feel like I was the one in the wrong when she cheated. She made excuses, blamed me for not being adventurous enough. But in the end, it wasn't about that. It was about her choices. Just like this is about Sarah's choices." I nodded slowly, letting his words settle in. "But what about the kids?" I asked, my voice low. "Lucas and Madison. How do I protect them from all this?" Alex leaned forward, his expression softening. "You fight for them, James. Whatever happens between you and Sarah, you make sure they're okay. You'll need a lawyer, but more importantly, you'll need to be strong for them. They're gonna need stability when all of this blows up." I knew he was right. Lucas and Madison were the most important part of all of this. No matter how broken I felt, I had to be strong for them. They couldn't lose both their parents over this mess. "Thanks, Alex," I said quietly, my voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He clapped me on the shoulder, a reassuring weight that grounded me, if only for a moment. "You're gonna get through this, man. But first things first, get a lawyer. You need to protect yourself and the kids." I nodded. I had no idea where to start, but I knew Alex was right. I needed to make sure that whatever happened next, I was ready for the fight. For Lucas and Madison. For myself. As I left the diner and headed back to my car, I realized I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. This wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal. It was about my future and the future of my kids. And I wasn't going to let her destroy that, too. I'd fight for what was left of my family, even if it meant cutting ties with her for good. The drive back from the diner was filled with a newfound sense of purpose. Alex was right, this wasn't just about what Sarah did. It was about making sure my kids had stability, a future, and a father they could count on. I couldn't let the chaos she brought into our lives affect them. Lucas and Madison were my priority now, and I wasn't going to let Sarah's reckless choices take that away from me. When I got home, the house felt colder than usual. The absence of Sarah, even though it was welcome, left a strange emptiness. Her shoes were still by the door, her jacket draped over the chair in the entryway. I had to remind myself that this was temporary. Soon I'd be packing up her things. Soon I'd be moving forward. I spent the rest of the morning searching for a divorce lawyer. It wasn't hard to find recommendations. Lakeview was a small enough town where everyone knew someone going through a tough split. After a few phone calls, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer named Greg Thompson. His reputation was solid, tough, no nonsense, and known for protecting his clients' interests in messy divorces. I didn't know how messy this would get, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be easy. The kids were still at my mother's for the weekend, so I had some time to myself. But instead of feeling relaxed, I felt restless. Every corner of the house reminded me of Sarah. It wasn't the memories of our good times that hurt the most. It was the realization that she had been willing to throw it all away for one night of excitement. And worse, she didn't even see the harm in it. By the time my phone buzzed again, I half expected it to be another message from Sarah. But it wasn't. It was Tom. "Hey, James. Alex told me what happened," he said when I picked up. "I'm so sorry, man. I can't believe she did that." "Yeah," I replied, rubbing my temples. "It's been a lot. You need anything? I'm here for you, man." "I appreciate that, Tom. I really do. But right now I'm just trying to figure out how to get through this and make sure the kids don't get caught in the middle of it." "Well, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And listen, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I think you need to know something about the Carters." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "There've been talk around town, nothing too concrete, but people have whispered about Jason and Melissa for years. You're not the first person to get blindsided by one of their traditions. They've hosted these parties for a while now, always with new couples. They put on this front of being upstanding, respectable folks, but behind closed doors, it's a different story." I clenched my jaw. Of course, it wasn't just Sarah and me who had been caught up in this mess. The Carters had been pulling people into their little game for years. And now, Sarah had fallen for it. "What do you mean by blindsided? Do other marriages fall apart because of them?" I asked, anger simmering under my skin. "Yeah, a few. Most people don't talk about it because, well, they're embarrassed. But I think it's time someone puts an end to this. It's not just a tradition, James. It's manipulation. They lure people in with this idea of freedom and excitement, but they're tearing families apart." My mind started racing. I wasn't just angry at Sarah anymore. I was angry at the Carters, at the whole twisted charade they had turned their parties into. They had been the ones who made it seem normal, who presented it as some harmless bit of fun. But it wasn't fun. It was destruction, pure and simple. "Do you think there's a way to expose them?" I asked, my voice low. Tom paused. "I don't know, but we could try. Maybe reach out to a reporter, someone who'd be willing to dig into what's really going on behind the scenes." A plan began forming in my mind. The Carters had been hiding behind their respectability for too long. If Sarah wanted to defend what she did, fine. But I wasn't going to let her or anyone else pretend that this was just a harmless bit of fun. People needed to know the truth. "Let's do it," I said, the decision clear in my mind. "Let's take them down." Tom agreed, and we started putting together everything we knew. It wasn't much, yet, but it was enough to start. We'd need more, though. Evidence, witnesses, anything that could blow this wide open. As the day wore on, I felt something I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Control. It wouldn't fix what happened with Sarah. But if I could expose the Carters for who they really were, maybe it would stop this from happening to someone else. Maybe it would keep more families from falling apart the way mine had. Later that afternoon, I got a message from Sarah. Another attempt to justify her actions. "James, we need to talk. I don't understand why you're making this into such a big deal. It's not like I don't love you. It was just one night. Please, let's talk." I stared at the message. The words, "just one night," jumping off the screen. She still didn't get it. I wasn't going to respond. There was nothing more to say. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Greg Thompson, and the fight for my kids would begin. But tonight, I had to focus. I had to start building the case against the Carters, and I wouldn't stop until they were exposed for who they really were. The next day arrived, and with it came the meeting that would set the wheels of change in motion. I drove to Greg Thompson's office, feeling a mix of nerves and resolve. I knew that once I crossed this threshold, there was no turning back. It was time to fight, not just for myself, but for Lucas and Madison. Greg's office was in a quiet, nondescript building on the edge of town. Inside, the atmosphere was calm but professional. Framed diplomas, shelves lined with thick legal books, and the faint smell of polished wood. Greg himself was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a serious demeanor that immediately told me I'd made the right choice. He didn't waste time with small talk. "James, I've read over the details you sent me about your situation. It's not a pretty one, but I've seen worse. Let's focus on what we can control here, your kids, your finances, and making sure you come out of this as clean as possible." I nodded, trying to swallow the knot in my throat. "I need to protect my kids, Greg. Sarah, she doesn't see how what she did is wrong. I'm worried that this is just the beginning for her. If she thinks these kinds of parties are acceptable, how do I know what else she's capable of?" Greg leaned back, assessing me carefully. "We'll approach this in a few steps. First, we'll file for divorce, citing infidelity. Luckily, In this state, adultery is solid grounds for divorce. And if we can prove it, and you've got enough evidence, we can potentially limit any spousal support she might try to claim. He paused, tapping his fingers on the desk. As for custody, that's trickier. Family courts favor joint custody unless there's evidence that the other parent is unfit. If Sarah's behavior at these parties can be shown to be irresponsible or damaging to the children, it'll help your case. Do you have anything concrete about her involvement? I hesitated. Not yet. But I'm working on it. Greg raised an eyebrow. Working on it? I leaned forward, feeling the pulse of my plan start to beat in my chest. There's more going on here, Greg. These parties that Jason and Melissa Carter host, it's not just a one-off thing. They've been doing this for years. They lure people in, couples like Sarah and me. And before you know it, marriages are falling apart. They act like it's some harmless fun, but it's wrecking lives. We're digging into it, gathering proof. If I can expose them, I think it'll show the court what kind of influence Sarah's been under. Greg nodded slowly, processing the information. If we can link Sarah's actions to a pattern of destructive behavior hosted by the Carters, it'll strengthen your case. But be careful, James. Exposing something like this can be messy. And if it blows up, it could backfire. People might not want their dirty laundry aired, especially if they're influential in the community. I know, I said, meeting his gaze. But I'm willing to take that risk. They need to be stopped. Greg sighed, but didn't argue. All right, let's take it one step at a time. We'll start the divorce process. And if you can get more evidence, we'll incorporate it into your case. Just be sure it's solid. We spent the next hour going over details, documents, finances, the process for serving Sarah with divorce papers. When we finished, I felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. This was real now. The fight had officially begun. As I left Greg's office, I checked my phone. There was another message from Sarah. This time, the tone was different. James, I know you're upset, but please don't do this. We can fix this. It's not worth throwing everything away over one night. Think about Lucas and Madison. They need both of us. It was the first time she'd mentioned the kids in her messages. For a brief second, I felt a pang of doubt. Did I really want to put Lucas and Madison through a divorce? Would they understand why their parents couldn't be together anymore? But then I remembered Sarah's complete lack of remorse, her casual dismissal of everything we had built. And I knew that staying together for the sake of the kids wouldn't solve anything. In fact, it would only make things worse in the long run. They needed stability, and I couldn't provide that in a marriage where trust had been shattered. I didn't reply to her message. There was no point. The papers would be served soon enough, and then she'd understand just how serious I was. That night, Tom and I met up again, this time with more information. He'd done some digging, asking around town discreetly, and we were starting to put together a clearer picture of what had been happening at the Carters' parties. It wasn't just isolated to one group. There were whispers of other couples who had gone through the same thing. Marriages broken, people falling apart. We need more concrete proof, Tom said, leaning in over his beer. A reporter won't just run with hearsay. We need someone willing to talk, someone who's been through it and can go on record. I nodded, thinking hard. Do you think any of the couples would be willing to come forward? Anyone who's already left the scene, so to speak. Tom shrugged. Possibly, but it's risky. People like to keep this stuff quiet. Even the ones who've been hurt by it might not want to admit they were involved. We'll figure it out, I said, more to myself than to him. I had to believe that we could. The Carters had been getting away with this for too long. And Sarah? Sarah had become a part of their web. Maybe she didn't realize it yet, but she had been manipulated, pulled into something she couldn't see the full consequences of. But that didn't change what she had done, and it didn't change what I had to do now. As we left the bar that night, I felt the weight of the coming days settle over me. I was fighting a battle on two fronts, one for my kids and one to expose the truth. And neither was going to be easy. The next few days were a blur of preparations and tense anticipation. Greg had filed the divorce papers, and it was only a matter of time before Sarah was officially served. I couldn't stop thinking about how she would react, how she would finally understand the seriousness of what she'd done. But beyond the looming legal battle, my mind was focused on a bigger goal, exposing the Carters. Tom and I had worked out a plan to gather more evidence. We knew we needed someone who had been a part of the Carters' inner circle, someone who had seen firsthand how their twisted traditions were tearing apart marriages. It wasn't going to be easy, But we couldn't stop now. One evening, I sat in my living room, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call Sarah. Part of me wanted to hear her voice, to know if she had any real remorse yet. But the other part of me was afraid of what she might say. Every time I thought of her casual dismissal of what had happened, the anger came rushing back, stronger than before. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It wasn't Sarah, it was Tom. I found someone, he said without preamble. Her name's Heather. She used to be close with the Carters. Went to their parties a couple of times with her ex-husband before it tore their marriage apart. She's willing to talk. I sat up straighter, my heart racing. This was the break we needed. Does she want to go on record? She's nervous, Tom admitted. She doesn't want her name out there just yet, but she's willing to meet with us and tell her story. If we can convince her that it's worth it, maybe she'll be our key to taking down the Carters. Set it up, I said, my voice firm. I need to hear what she has to say. 2 days later, Tom and I met Heather at a small cafe on the edge of town. She was in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and a weary expression that told me she had been through more than her fair share of heartache. As we sat down, I noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. Thanks for agreeing to meet with us, I said, trying to keep my tone calm and reassuring. I know this isn't easy. Heather nodded, her eyes flicking nervously around the room as if she expected someone to overhear. I'm doing this because I know how it feels to be blindsided by people you trust. The Carters, they made it seem so harmless at first. Just a bit of fun, something to spice things up. But it's not fun when it tears your life apart. Her voice cracked slightly, and I could hear the pain beneath the surface. My ex-husband and I were in a good place. Or at least I thought we were. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but nothing major. Then Melissa started talking to me about the parties. How couples went there to, explore new things. She made it sound like it would save our marriage, bring us closer. Heather paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. At first I didn't want to go, but my ex Brian was intrigued. He kept saying, "What's the harm in trying? It's just one night." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with bitterness. Just one night. That's how they always frame it. Like it's no big deal. I knew exactly how those words felt. They echoed Sarah's justifications, her insistence that it was just one night. Heather continued, her voice quieter now. We went to 2 parties. The first one we didn't actually participate. We just watched, got a feel for how things worked. I thought maybe it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. But the second time, Brian picked another woman's bracelet. I picked some random guys. That night changed everything. She looked down, her eyes misty. After that, we weren't the same. He became distant, more interested in the next party than in us. And me? I couldn't get over the fact that I'd seen him with someone else. Someone else touching him, laughing with him. It destroyed me. We tried to make it work after that, but it was like trying to glue together something that was already shattered. I nodded, understanding every word. And the Carters? Did they ever express any remorse for what their parties did to you? Heather let out a bitter laugh. Remorse? No. They acted like it was our fault, like we weren't strong enough to handle their adventure. But it's not about strength. It's about manipulation. They lure people in, make it seem like everyone's doing it, like you'll be the odd one out if you don't participate. It's toxic. Tom leaned forward. Heather, I know this is hard, but we need people like you to expose what's going on. There are others out there who've been hurt by this. If you're willing to go on record to share your story, we can take them down. She hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know. I've moved on from all of that. I'm finally getting my life back together. I get that, I said softly. But there's still couples out there falling into this trap. People like me, like you, and they're still being hurt. If we don't expose the Carters, they'll keep doing it. Heather was silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on something far away. Finally, she sighed and looked up at us. All right, I'll do it. But I want my name protected for now. I don't want to deal with the backlash. I nodded. We'll make sure you're safe. As we left the cafe, I felt a surge of hope. We had what we needed. Heather's story, combined with the other evidence we were gathering, would be enough to blow this whole thing wide open. The Carters had been hiding in plain sight for too long, and now it was only a matter of time before their world came crashing down. Now it was time to finalize the next step. Exposing the Carters was one thing, but I still had a divorce to deal with, a fight for my kids, and the emotional wreckage that Sarah had left behind. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I was starting to see a way out. A way forward. The next few days moved quickly. Heather's testimony had given us the ammunition we needed to push forward. Tom and I connected her with the reporter from the Lakeview Times, who promised to investigate further. He was intrigued, and with Heather's detailed account, he agreed to keep digging into the Carters' secret world of manipulative parties. I focused on preparing for what came next, serving Sarah the divorce papers. Greg called to let me know everything was ready. He'd had the papers drawn up with infidelity as the cause, and it was clear that I was fighting for custody of Lucas and Madison. Finally, the day came. Sarah was served at her workplace. I wasn't there, but Greg filled me in later. She had been caught completely off guard. He said she looked shocked, maybe even hurt. For a second, a pang of guilt hit me, but I quickly pushed it down. This wasn't my doing. She had made her choices. That evening, my phone buzzed with a call from her. I hesitated before picking up. I knew I'd have to face her eventually, and delaying it any further wouldn't help. James? Her voice was shaky, full of disbelief. You filed for divorce? Yes, I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could. I told you this was coming, Sarah. After what you did, there's no going back. There was a pause, and I could hear her struggling to keep her composure. It was one night, James. One mistake. Can't we talk about this? Think about the kids. I'm thinking about the kids. They need stability, and I'm going to fight for that. You didn't just make a mistake, Sarah, you broke us. And there's no fixing that. The silence on the other end of the line stretched painfully long, until finally, she spoke again, her voice low and broken. So that's it. That's it, I said, my chest heavy. And then, before either of us could say more, I ended the call. I sat there for a long time after, staring at the phone, my mind spinning with the reality of it all. The divorce was real now, and so was the fight for my kids. There was no turning back. The next move was exposing the Carters. And soon, the town of Lakeview would see them for who they really were. The days that followed felt like a waiting game, but I could sense the storm building. The reporter from Lakeview Times had promised the article would come out soon, and Heather had already provided enough damning information to make waves. Sarah hadn't reached out again after our last conversation, but I knew the silence wouldn't last. I kept myself busy, focusing on the kids. Lucas and Madison had no idea what was going on yet, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation with them. Not until everything was in motion. I'd picked them up from my mom's, and we spent the weekend like nothing had changed: pizza, movies, a trip to the park. For those few hours, I managed to push the weight of everything aside and just be their dad. But I knew it couldn't last forever. Monday morning came with a sense of dread and anticipation. I'd been checking the Lakeview Times website regularly, waiting for the article to drop. And then just before noon it happened. Suburban Secrets. Inside Lakeview's hidden world of scandalous parties. The headline hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I had known it was coming. The article went into detail about the Carters' parties, how they lured couples into their web under the guise of innocent fun, and how it had destroyed more than one marriage. Heather's account was anonymous as promised, but her story was there, loud and clear. It didn't take long for the town to start buzzing. The scandal spread fast. People whispered in coffee shops, the phones rang nonstop in offices, and I could see it all unfold on social media. People were horrified, shocked that something like this had been happening right under their noses. And Sarah, along with everyone else who had ever attended one of those parties, was now under the harsh spotlight of public judgment. It wasn't long before I got a message from Sarah. This time it wasn't calm or pleading. It was angry, defensive. Are you happy now, James? You've humiliated me. The whole town's talking about us. How could you do this? I stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to respond, to remind her that this wasn't just about us. This was about what she had done, what she had been willing to destroy. But another part of me didn't care what she thought anymore. I had to protect myself and the kids, and I had to make sure this never happened again to anyone else. I didn't respond. By the end of the day, the fallout had already begun. The Carters' pristine reputation was shattered, their name dragged through the mud. People were distancing themselves from them, and I knew it wouldn't be long before their little circle of influence crumbled completely. But there was still one battle left, Sarah, and that fight was just beginning. The days following the article's release were chaotic. Lakeview, once quiet and respectable, had turned into a pressure cooker of gossip and outrage. People whispered about the Carters and their parties, and the fallout hit hard. Jason and Melissa became pariahs overnight, their perfect suburban image shattered. The town's judgment was swift and merciless, and the Carters had nowhere to hide. But while the Carters' world crumbled, I knew my focus had to be on Sarah and the divorce. The papers had been served, the public scandal had blown wide open. And now, it was time to settle everything once and for all. A week after the article was published, Sarah finally called again. This time, her voice was different, not the casual indifference from before, not the anger from her last message, but something more vulnerable. She sounded defeated. "James, can we please talk?" she asked, her voice quiet. "In person?" Part of me wanted to say no, to keep my distance until everything was finalized. But another part of me, the part that had shared a decade of life with her, knew that we needed closure. Not just for ourselves, but for our kids. So, I agreed to meet her at a neutral spot, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, Sarah was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She looked worn down, her usual confidence replaced by a kind of quiet sadness. As I sat across from her, we didn't speak right away. We just sat there, two people who had once built a life together, now staring at the wreckage. "I'm sorry," she finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "I know I never said it before, and maybe it's too late, but I'm sorry, James. I didn't realize how far things had gone. I didn't understand what I was risking until it was too late." I didn't respond right away. I could feel the weight of her words, but the damage had already been done. Apologies wouldn't change what had happened, but at least, for the first time, there was a glimmer of remorse. "You didn't just hurt me, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "You hurt our family. You hurt the kids. I'm trying to protect them from all of this, but it's not easy. You chose to throw everything away, and I still don't understand why." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly. "I was selfish. I know that now. I thought it was just fun, that it would make things more exciting. But I didn't think about what it would cost." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was still anger, still pain, but there was also a sense of finality. I knew then that no matter how sorry she was, we were past the point of saving our marriage. "I'm moving forward with the divorce," I said gently but firmly. "I need to protect Lucas and Madison. We'll work out the custody arrangement, but this," I gestured, "between us, it's over." Sarah looked down at her hands, nodding slowly. "I know," she whispered. "I know it's over." We sat in silence for a few more moments, the weight of our shared history pressing down on us. Then, she spoke again, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to lose you, James. You lost me the moment you chose them," I replied quietly. "The moment you put that bracelet in the basket." She didn't argue. She just nodded, accepting the truth. When we finally parted ways, it was without bitterness. It was clear now, our paths had diverged. There was no turning back, and I was at peace with that. The divorce proceedings moved forward, and Greg ensured I had a solid case. In the end, I was granted primary custody of Lucas and Madison, and Sarah had weekend visitation. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best solution for the kids. As for the Carters, they disappeared from Lakeview, their reputation in ruins. The scandal had done its job, and their little circle of influence was gone. Heather's bravery in coming forward helped stop their toxic parties from ruining more lives, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction knowing that justice had been served, at least in some form. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The kids adjusted to the new routine, and I focused on being the best father I could be. Sarah stayed on the periphery of our lives, still a part of the kids' world, but no longer mine. One evening, as I sat with Lucas and Madison, watching them laugh and play, I realized something. The pain of what had happened still lingered, but I had found peace in knowing that I had stood by my principles. I had fought for my kids, for myself, and for what was right. The past was behind me, and a new chapter had begun. And in that there was hope.